Hey guys, we're back for Section 4. The Mongol Empire is a Eurasian network in our pastoral peoples on the global stage. After covering Section 3, which compared China and the Mongols, Persia and the Mongols, and Russia and the Mongols, it's not a bad idea to set up a comparative chart on the effects of Mongol rule in those various parts of their empire. How did the rule differ in China, Russia, and the Middle East, and even Central Asia? And what aspects were similar? What were the short-term effects as opposed to the long-term effects? Those are some things to think about in those three areas. And we'll continue on now with Section 4. Okay, toward a world economy. So the Mongols produced little for distant markets. They weren't active traders, but they promoted international commerce as a source of tax revenue. And by doing so, it made it relatively safe, again, to travel across Central Asia. And the Mongol trading circuit was central to larger Afro-Eurasian commercial networks. So they were not necessarily producers or traders, but they promoted commerce. While the Mongols didn't make anything or actively, well, not actively, but extensively engage in trade, they did promote production and commerce in the areas that they controlled. And they even provided tax breaks for merchants and sometimes paying high prices to attract commerce to their cities. And like I said, this produced, or actually not produced, but created security on the Silk Roads. Before, the Silk Roads had been relatively secure, and then with the fall of the Roman Empire, and this, that 1,000-year period of a focus on the Arab Empire, their main circuits of trade were the Indian Ocean and the Sahara. Very little on the Silk Roads, and so they weren't necessarily safe. But now that the Mongols controlled this entire vast area where the Silk Roads were located, again, the Silk Roads became secure. The most important contribution was an unprecedented security on the Silk Roads by the Mongols. This allowed for a dramatic increase in trade throughout most of Central Asia, with many individuals making the entire journey from west to east and back. And that's why those posting stations were so important. Marco Polo was the most famous European, but many others used guidebooks on their trips. And this connected the larger world system. The Mongol trade circuit connected to other trade networks throughout the rest of Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, doing much to forge a global economy. All right, diplomacy on a Eurasian scale. The Mongol encroachment into Eastern Europe led both the Pope and European rulers to dispatch diplomatic missions to the Mongols. They had no diplomatic or religious consequences, but they did bring back valuable information about the East. And the Persian and Chinese courts developed close relationships because of this. The European envoys that they sent east, because the Mongols made their way into Eastern Europe about 1241, 1242, and they seemed poised to even take control of the region. But at this point in time, it was the death of the great Khan Ogadai, which is related to Chinggis Khan, required that the Mongol leaders return home. Therefore, they could not continue their campaign into Eastern Europe. And aware of the threat of the Mongols, or that the Mongols posed, those European kings and even the Pope sent diplomats east to negotiate with the Mongols. And this led to the European discovery of the outside world. These missions provided the previously isolated Europeans with a wealth of knowledge about the rest of the world. And it really linked China and Persia because of the Mongols. These two great empires were part of a larger Mongol system. Communications between the two increased. Thus, the Mongols created an unprecedented level of international communication. That is very important. And here is a map. Hopefully it doesn't look too busy as you initially take a look at it. But this dark orange is a likely source of the plague. And the lighter orange are the regions that were heavily affected by the plague. And of course you can see, and we'll talk about the plague here in just a second, but you can see the routes that the plague probably traveled. And if you'll notice, this really is linked to the world trade circuits, right, within these big trade networks. And that's where people are traveling, and that makes sense. Okay, cultural exchange in the Mongol realm. Thousands of craftsmen and educated people were forcibly relocated. That says related. I just realized that. It should say relocated by the Mongols. And the Mongol religious tolerance and support of merchants really drew in a lot of foreigners. The Mongol capital of Karakoram was this chic and cosmopolitan, sophisticated center of a lot of activity. So let's go back up here for a second. The forced population transfers and even some voluntary migrations were done by the Mongols. They forced some people, especially artisans and engineers, to move from one place to another based on where their skills were needed. And others moved freely as part of a religious travel tolerated by the Mongols, or as part of commercial activity that was heavily encouraged by the Mongols. And thus, technology transfer, the spread of crops, especially the technology, especially from China, moved freely and quickly within the Mongol domain, as did even medical knowledge. And various crops were carried from one region to another. So Europe actually gained the most. They were poor, backwards, and isolated. And so they gained the most from these exchanges. As it had the least to offer, it gained the most, right? And this may have set Europe on the path toward expansion or involvement in those international trade networks. And so we see this lively exchange of ideas and techniques, especially with that westward flow of Chinese technology and art, painting, printing, gunpowder weapons, which we learned eventually Europeans used to develop the cannon. Compass navigation. We've learned about the compass that was invented by the Chinese, obviously very important in sea travel especially. High temperature furnaces, and like I said, medical knowledge, medical techniques. Muslim astronomy spread to China, and of course the heavy circulation of new plants and crops and some even animals, and particularly Europe benefited the most with that contact. Okay, now let's talk about the plague. The plague, some call it pestilence, the Black Death. It spread across trade routes of the Mongol Empire in the early 14th century. Probably originated in Central Asia. It was carried by rodents and transmitted by fleas. So the fleas that were on rodents is where the Black Death came from. It's actually a mutation of the Yersinia pestis, or bubonic plague, and it spread quickly. It killed large numbers in areas of heavily densely populated locations, and the death spread during the increase of trade from the fleas that lived on those rats. The plague broke out in northeastern China in 1331, reached the Middle East and Western Europe by 1347. The Mongol siege of Katha, which is in the Crimea, in 1346. And a large part of that was because the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city. And I know that sounds really disgusting and awful and gross, but obviously it was quite effective. It's biological warfare on a grand scale that the world had never really seen before, with a purpose. So, and it started in China. It followed along those world trade routes, savaged cities across Eurasia. Some estimate that approximately 50% of Europeans may have perished. Historians generally agree on about a 33%, a third of the population of Europe, but some have even estimated up to 50. And so this was a, massive death toll, even in East Africa, where it reached in 1409. Half of Europe, like I said, maybe half of Europe's population, even perhaps a third of the population of the Middle East. And there were actually 3 strains of this plague, and the bubonic plague that hit Europe, they've heard about, was actually the least worse of the 3. They're all 3. They were awful and really painful, really bad. Most people would die within a week. The really bad one, you probably died within hours. That's how awful it was. And there have been periodic returns of the plague for centuries, and so that led many to believe, is this the end of the world? In this pre-scientific era of high religious beliefs, some in the Christian and the Islamic world saw it as the end of days. Armageddon was coming. And so, there were some major effects of the plague. India and sub-Saharan Africa are much less affected, and that probably has to do with geographical barriers. India and the northern part of India are the Himalayan mountains, hard to travel across. Sub-Saharan Africa, hard to get to when it's coming from Europe or the northern parts of, not the northern parts, but, the northern parts of Africa, along the Mediterranean coast and through the Middle East. There's a huge desert that's hard to travel across. So, India and sub-Saharan Africa were much less affected, but it permanently changed European society, especially European society, for the long term. Labor shortages undermined the practice of serfdom, and that may have fostered greater technological innovation, and especially in the areas of science and medicine. And for a time, it created even more employment opportunities for women. And so, with so many dead, there were labor shortages, and those new opportunities for skilled workers, women, even peasants. And the mass death set in motion several important social changes. And there was also a rise in labor-saving devices, like I said, spurring from those technological innovations in Europe. But this was also, I thought I had one more slide. Sorry. This is also a primary reason for the breakdown of the Mongol Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries.